Section 1, Grandpa's Jeep and Karen's Obsession, begins. Grandpa had always been a man of simple pleasures. His morning coffee on the porch, tending to the small flower beds that lined the edge of his driveway, and the pride he felt every time he polished his cherry red Jeep, which had been in the family for decades, a relic of freedom and independence that he had restored with his own hands, every dent carefully smoothed, every bolt tightened, and every tire checked before taking it for a slow cruise through the neighborhood. Yet all of this quiet joy did not escape the sharp, scrutinizing eyes of Karen, the HOA chairwoman who saw herself as the ultimate arbiter of Maplewood Estates, a woman whose obsession with control, neatness, and imagined slights had long haunted the street like a shadow that never left, and the moment she noticed Grandpa's Jeep parked slightly off-center, with one wheel on the edge of the grass, she felt a shiver of indignation run through her, as if the very universe had conspired to defy her. And from that moment, a slow-burning campaign of petty tyranny began to take shape in her mind, one that she would nurture and cultivate with the same intensity and attention to detail that Grandpa had poured into his Jeep, but with a far more sinister intent, for in her eyes, the vehicle represented not freedom but chaos, not personality but defiance, not joy but a direct affront to her meticulously ordered world. Karen began her vigil immediately, walking past Grandpa's driveway multiple times a day under the guise of casual neighborhood checks, clipboard clutched tightly to her chest, jotting down imagined infractions, each step measured and precise, as though she were cataloging the very essence of disorder, her mind racing with schemes of how she could bend the rules, manipulate the HOA board, and ultimately force Grandpa to surrender his Jeep or face escalating penalties. And while most neighbors went about their business, some noticing her increasing agitation and muttered threats, others secretly shaking their heads at her pettiness, Karen's gaze remained fixed, laser-focused, never blinking, imagining herself victorious while painting Grandpa in her mind as the obstinate old man who refused to respect community standards, all the while ignoring decades of his kindness, generosity, and quiet contributions to the neighborhood. The truth that Grandpa had fixed fences for families who couldn't afford a handyman, delivered groceries to shut-in neighbors, and shared stories that kept the children entertained on long summer afternoons, none of which mattered to Karen. Because to her, compliance with her own rigid, self-appointed code was the only thing that counted, and she would stop at nothing to enforce it, even if that meant turning the entire HOA against an innocent man. Karen's obsession quickly escalated beyond casual observations as she began photographing Grandpa's Jeep from multiple angles, taking note of minor imperfections in the paint, slight misalignments in the parking, even the way the morning sun reflected off the hood, all cataloged meticulously in folders labeled Grandpa Jeep violations, each image accompanied by a handwritten note detailing her imagined threats to property value, neighborhood aesthetics, and community safety, and she shared these files with the few HOA board members she had managed to sway, emphasizing in her dramatic presentations that Grandpa was not merely negligent, but dangerously non-compliant, framing his independence as a community liability. And though some board members whispered in private that Karen had gone too far, the fear of her wrath kept them silent, nodding along to avoid becoming the next target of her relentless scrutiny, while Grandpa continued his quiet life, completely unaware of the storm. Brewing, tinkering under the hood of his Jeep, humming softly as he polished chrome, adjusting mirrors, and running the engine to ensure every gear shifted smoothly, his heart light, his mind at ease, completely oblivious to Karen's plotting, unaware that her obsession would soon escalate into a full-blown attempt to seize his property, and in doing so disrupt not only his daily routine, but the sense of safety, independence, and pride that he had cultivated over decades. For to Karen, it was never about fairness, legality, or reason. It was about control, dominance, and the thrill of watching someone else squirm under her relentless pressure, and the seeds of conflict had been sown, invisible yet potent, poised to grow into a battle that would engulf the neighborhood, draw the attention of every resident, and ultimately set the stage for a showdown that no one could have predicted, a confrontation between tyranny and dignity, obsession and patience, fear and courage, and all of it began with a simple cherry red Jeep sitting quietly in Grandpa's driveway, shining in the sun, entirely unaware that it had become the epicenter of Karen's relentless vendetta, a symbol not of danger, but of freedom, independence, and the resilience of a man who had lived his life with integrity, kindness, and quiet strength, and whose fight was only just beginning. Section 2, Karen threatens Grandpa, and involves HOA. After weeks of obsessively monitoring Grandpa's Jeep, Karen escalated her campaign, convinced that mere scrutiny and whispered complaints would never suffice, and so she began to marshal the full force of the HOA bureaucracy, flooding the office with memos, complaints, and formal violation notices, each one carefully crafted to exaggerate minor details into grave offenses, and she did so with a gleeful, almost theatrical sense of righteousness, convinced that the entire neighborhood would bow to her vision of perfection, that the weight of her authority could crush the stubborn old man into submission, all while painting herself as the selfless guardian of community standards, the only person brave enough to stand up to Grandpa's reckless defiance, and her actions quickly became a daily ordeal for him, as letters with stamped deadlines and threats of fines began to arrive in the mailbox, each one addressed in bold, commanding typeface, declaring that his Jeep was in violation of multiple HOA rules, from improper parking alignment to alleged safety hazards that did not exist, all accompanied by Karen's handwritten notes warning him that failure to comply could result in the vehicle being towed immediately, and she did not hesitate to follow up these letters with phone calls, leaving messages dripping with insinuation and veiled threats. "I hope you understand the seriousness of this, Mr. Thompson. This is not optional. Compliance is expected." Her tone sweetly poisonous, as though kindness itself could mask her aggression, and each call left Grandpa feeling a heavy ache in his chest, a mixture of disbelief, frustration, and simmering anger that he struggled to contain, for he had lived decades in this neighborhood in peace, contributing quietly, helping others, and now found himself targeted simply for existing as he always had, tending to his Jeep, maintaining his independence, and refusing to bow to the whims of a woman who had decided he was a problem to be solved rather than a neighbor to be respected. Karen's obsession did not stop at letters and phone calls. She began to manipulate other HOA members, setting up emergency meetings where she presented her narrative with the flair of a seasoned orator, waving her meticulously prepared folders full of doctored photographs, exaggerated claims, and speculative dangers, telling the board that Grandpa's Jeep was an eyesore, a hazard, and a direct threat to property values, claiming that the vehicle's presence undermined neighborhood standards. While a few members, hesitant and uneasy, tried to ask for evidence or context, only to be silenced by Karen's icy glares and quick retorts. "This is not a debate. This is reality. If we allow him to continue, we are all complicit." And slowly, insidiously, she began to sow doubt and fear among the residents, whispering in hallways and slipping letters under doors, suggesting that anyone who supported Grandpa was naive, careless, or condoning a dangerous precedent, creating a climate of tension that turned neighbor against neighbor, as small talk about lawn care and weekend plans was replaced by murmurs of complaints, questions, and uneasy glances toward Grandpa's driveway. And though many saw through her theatrics, the anxiety she generated was enough to leave some hesitant, unsure whether to speak up or simply comply with her narrative in order to avoid becoming her next target, while Grandpa, receiving the mounting evidence of her vendetta, felt the weight of isolation creeping in, knowing that her relentless pursuit was not driven by logic or fairness, but by obsession, control, and an almost personal vendetta that had transformed a simple vehicle into a battleground. Despite the stress, Grandpa refused to buckle. He meticulously documented every letter, every complaint, every call, stacking them in neat folders on his kitchen table, cross-referencing HOA rules, photographing his Jeep from multiple angles to prove compliance, and quietly reaching out to neighbors he trusted, those who knew his character, asking for moral support, advice, and sometimes just companionship as he endured the harassment, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with Karen's escalating frenzy, which now included threats to levy fines, demand towing, and even contact law enforcement if she deemed the Jeep unsafe, all of which made her obsession palpable, almost theatrical in its intensity, drawing whispers and curiosity from every street corner. While Grandpa continued to live his life with quiet dignity, refusing to rise to her bait, refusing to let her see the frustration she so desperately sought to provoke, and in doing so, he began to unintentionally rally support as neighbors quietly started noticing the absurdity and cruelty of her actions. Recognizing that this was no longer about rules or property, it was about one woman's obsession with control and a community's instinctive desire to protect one of their own from unnecessary tyranny. Karen's attempts to leverage fear and manipulation soon reached their peak as she sent certified letters warning of imminent towing, placed notices on the Jeep, and attempted to stage public warnings, all while pacing and fuming in her home office, convinced that Grandpa would crumble under the weight of bureaucracy and intimidation, that he would beg for mercy, apologize, and perhaps even relinquish his beloved Jeep to her control. Yet every attempt failed to produce the result she craved, and the more she failed, the more her obsession grew, transforming into an almost visible aura of desperation and rage that neighbors could sense from a distance, a storm of entitlement and cruelty confined to a single woman who had mistaken compliance with morality, rules with justice, and authority with virtue. And as Grandpa calmly prepared for each new volley of letters and threats, he also began to quietly communicate with the sheriff's office, explain the situation, document harassment, and make sure that when the inevitable confrontation came, he would have law enforcement on his side, not as an aggressive tool, but as a shield against Karen's obsessive vendetta, all while continuing to polish his Jeep, checking tire pressure, and making sure that everything was in perfect working order, silently daring her to make her move, knowing that when she did, the truth and support of the community would stand firmly with him, and that her obsession, so carefully nurtured and sharpened over weeks, would ultimately become her own undoing in the eyes of every witness, every neighbor, and eventually the law itself. P Section 3, Sabotage and the Rise of Allies After the Failed Inspection Day, Karen's obsession with destroying Grandma's garden intensified to a near-manic level, and she began devising schemes that were far more underhanded than public complaints or HOA meetings. She walked the streets in the dead of night, clipboard tucked under her arm, spying from behind hedges, snapping pictures with her phone, and jotting down every little imperfection she could conjure in her mind as a violation, even going so far as to fabricate stories about alleged safety hazards, claiming the garden could be hiding snakes or attracting dangerous insects, though anyone who actually visited would see only hummingbirds, bees, and butterflies working in perfect harmony with the flowers. She even tried to bribe the local landscaper, offering to pay him extra if he would point out problems and exaggerate them to city officials. But the man, a good-hearted fellow who had worked in the neighborhood for decades, shook his head and said, "Ma'am, this garden is a work of art. I couldn't lie about it, even if you paid me double." Infuriated, Karen began to grow desperate, moving from subtle harassment to overt sabotage. She spread rumors that the irrigation system Grandma installed was faulty, hoping someone would complain to the HOA about standing water or unsafe conditions. She contacted a local garden club under the guise of concern, suggesting that Grandma's colorful pots were somehow non-compliant with their aesthetic standards, and she even tried sneaking into the backyard one evening to remove a particularly flamboyant sunflower that towered over the others, only to be caught by Grandma's cat, a spry calico named Marmalade, who hissed and swatted Karen's hand so hard she yelped and ran away, leaving her dignity and her gloves behind in the flower bed. Each failed attempt only strengthened Grandma's resolve. She laughed quietly to herself at Karen's antics and used them as opportunities to teach me and the neighborhood children about resilience, kindness, and the joy of nurturing something beautiful even when others seek to destroy it. Grandma would say, "Sometimes the weeds are loud, but they don't stop the flowers from growing." And her words became a mantra, repeated by neighbors who had grown tired of Karen's pettiness and wanted to stand beside the woman who had brought so much color and life to their streets. As Karen escalated, something unexpected happened. The neighborhood, which had mostly watched from a distance, began to take action. One by one, people who had admired Grandma's garden quietly began offering help, volunteering to water the plants during hot spells, bring extra soil and compost, or even donate old garden ornaments they no longer needed. Local teenagers, Initially curious visitors to the carnival garden began creating small handmade signs to add to the whimsical display, each one signed with their names as a subtle show of solidarity. The neighborhood book club offered to hold a meeting in the garden, promising to discuss stories about resilience and kindness while surrounded by Grandma's flowers. Even the local cafe, known for its cautious neutrality, put up a small flyer celebrating Grandma's garden as a hidden gem, encouraging people to stop by and find a moment of joy. The more Karen tried to intimidate and control, the more the community rallied around Grandma, drawn not just by the beauty of the garden, but by the principle of standing up against needless cruelty. At every turn, Karen was confronted by not only Grandma's quiet, unwavering grace, but also by an invisible army of neighbors who refused to be cowed by her narrow-mindedness. Emails, texts, and casual conversations began to circulate in secret networks. "If Karen tries anything, we'll be there to help," people said, and their support, while silent and understated, became a force far stronger than Karen's lone rage. Karen, predictably, was oblivious to the growing alliance. She believed herself a master strategist, confident that her knowledge of HOA rules and her ability to manipulate public perception would give her the upper hand. She underestimated one critical thing: that true community, built on respect, love, and shared experience, could not be bullied into submission. One evening, in a particularly bold move, Karen decided to sabotage the garden more directly. She placed a large bag of fertilizer near the edge of the property, intending to dump it over the flower beds to destroy the delicate balance of nutrients Grandma had meticulously maintained for decades. What she did not anticipate was the careful attention Grandma paid to every inch of her garden. She had installed motion sensor lights to prevent critters from getting in, and the lights alerted Grandma's neighbor, Mr. Patel, a retired engineer who lived next door, who rushed over just in time to confront Karen with a flashlight and affirm, "What do you think you're doing?" Caught red-handed, Karen tried to mumble an excuse, but the more she spoke, the more ridiculous her explanations sounded. Mr. Patel, joined by several other neighbors who had gathered after noticing the commotion, escorted Karen off the property and made it clear that any further attempts at trespassing would result in legal action. That night, Grandma thanked her neighbors with a modest smile, insisting that she hadn't wanted the trouble, but the event only strengthened the bonds between her and the community, who now felt an almost protective duty toward her and the garden she loved. Meanwhile, Karen became increasingly erratic, her frustration simmering into paranoia. She started checking social media, searching for photos of Grandma's garden, hoping to find some flaw or complaint she could exploit online, only to discover that the garden had begun to trend locally. Amateur photographers, bloggers, and casual visitors posted pictures with hashtags like #CarnivalGarden, #Grandma'sBloom, and #NeighborhoodGem. Even strangers commented, marveling at the ingenuity of planting such vibrant flowers together and how the garden seemed to radiate a sense of warmth and welcome. Each new post, each shared photo, each message of praise acted like a shield around Grandma, protecting her from Karen's vitriol and making the HOA tyrant look increasingly ridiculous and petty in the eyes of the public. The irony was thick. Karen's attempts to discredit Grandma only amplified her reputation and created an aura of invincibility around the garden. Karen could not comprehend how her actions, meant to humiliate, were doing the exact opposite, inspiring joy, community, and admiration. And so, while Karen plodded late into the night, muttering to herself and scribbling frantic notes, the neighborhood flourished, flowers grew stronger, and alliances solidified, proving that kindness and beauty are forces that cannot be destroyed by anger, bitterness, or the rigid narrowness of a single determined adversary. Grandma, sitting quietly among her roses and marigolds, would only shake her head and smile, saying softly, "The world may throw stones, but flowers bend toward the sun anyway." And in that simple truth, the community found its rallying cry, a testament to the power of resilience, love, and the undeniable brilliance of a garden tended with care and courage, a garden that had become far more than just a collection of flowers, but a symbol of hope, joy, and victory against petty cruelty. Section 4. The public showdown. By the time summer reached its peak, Karen's obsession with destroying Grandma's garden had escalated to a fever pitch, and she decided that subtlety, spying, and small scale sabotage were no longer enough. She needed a public spectacle, a dramatic event that would humiliate Grandma in front of the entire neighborhood, prove her authority, and restore her bruised pride, or so she believed. And she set her plan into motion with meticulous precision: scheduling what she called the Neighborhood Garden Compliance Inspection Extravaganza, a gathering that she insisted must include not only the HOA board, but also select community members, local media contacts, and anyone else she could intimidate into witnessing what she envisioned as Grandma's defeat. And in preparation, she spent days drafting formal letters, creating official documents with logos. She improvised and practicing her speech in front of the mirror, adjusting her tone to maximize the drama, all while muttering to herself about how this time, finally, Grandma would be exposed for the eyesore she had always claimed to be. However, what Karen did not anticipate was the strength, ingenuity, and resolve that Grandma and the neighborhood had quietly been building in response to her persistent attacks. On the morning of the event, the air was thick with anticipation. But not just Karen's anticipation, for the neighborhood had learned of her plans, and a wave of solidarity began to swell among the residents, who had secretly coordinated to make the event a celebration rather than a humiliation, with banners, small gifts, and even a few live musicians who had volunteered to play cheerful tunes, transforming what Karen thought would be her triumphant moment into a communal festival of color, music, and laughter centered around the garden she had tried so desperately to destroy. Karen arrived first, clutching her clipboard and wearing a rigid expression of authority, expecting awed gasps of horror at Grandma's violation. But instead, she was met with cheers, waves, and smiling neighbors, many holding bouquets of flowers they had brought as a show of support, and her carefully crafted speech immediately faltered, her words sounding harsh and discordant against the backdrop of laughter, music, and birdsong. She attempted to regain control, raising her voice and insisting on the seriousness of the event, pointing to the towering sunflowers, the colorful ribbons, and the array of painted gnomes as evidence of disorder. But every complaint was met with a chorus of gentle but firm rebuttals, neighbors pointing out that not only was there no actual violation, but that the garden was a source of joy, inspiration, and community engagement, and even local photographers and bloggers had set up small stations to take photos and document the celebration, effectively turning Karen's intended attack into a publicity campaign that made her appear petty and out of touch. Grandma, dressed in her straw hat with the pink ribbon and a simple floral dress, moved quietly among her flowers, greeting visitors with warmth, offering small gardening tips, and laughing softly at Karen's increasingly flustered gestures. And at that moment, it became clear that Karen had underestimated not just the beauty of the garden, but the collective power of a community united by kindness and admiration. Children ran between the flower beds, weaving ribbons and painting small rocks to add to the whimsical display, while neighbors brought homemade lemonade and snacks to share, turning what was supposed to be a tense, humiliating inspection into a picnic-like celebration where the only thing that seemed out of place was Karen herself, standing stiffly at the edge of the garden, clipboard trembling slightly in her hands as her carefully constructed plan unraveled before her eyes, and every attempt she made to demand compliance, enforce imaginary rules, or highlight violations was countered with gentle humor, quiet resistance, or outright mockery from the crowd, who had by now begun whispering amongst themselves, exchanging glances that silently communicated, "Not today, Karen. Not here." At one point, Karen even tried to drag in a couple of local officials she had called in advance, only to find that they were charmed by Grandma's hospitality, the charm of the garden, and the evident joy of the community, leaving Karen's arguments falling flat and increasingly irrelevant, and by mid-morning, the entire spectacle had transformed from what she envisioned as a shaming session into a festival of color, laughter, and unity, an unplanned, unstoppable testament to resilience and the indestructible nature of genuine beauty and kindness. Karen, growing frantic, attempted one last desperate maneuver. She climbed onto a small stepladder, intending to loudly read aloud a list of violations she had cobbled together from her previous complaints, hoping that the formality and volume of her voice would drown out the crowd's positivity. But even then, her authority was systematically dismantled. Children shouted out cheerful corrections, neighbors waved, laughter drowned her voice, and one clever teen even held up a handmade sign that read, "Karen, flowers rules," causing the crowd to erupt into supportive applause, leaving Karen frozen mid-sentence, flushed and shaking, realizing that the script she had rehearsed so meticulously had been rendered meaningless by the force of joy and community spirit. Meanwhile, Grandma, calm as ever, continued tending her roses, humming the same tune she always did, completely unbothered by Karen's theatrics, and when a neighbor gently offered her a chair to watch the inspection, she waved them off, saying simply, "I'd rather be with my flowers." They don't judge and they forgive quickly. The irony was not lost on anyone present. Karen had come to humiliate, to assert power, to impose her sterile vision. Yet she was utterly powerless in the face of beauty, authenticity, and collective support, and every attempt she made only amplified the garden's charm, drew more attention, and inspired deeper loyalty from the community. By the end of the day, Karen's campaign had failed spectacularly. She had hoped for embarrassment. Instead, she had witnessed admiration and celebration. She had anticipated submission. Instead, she had encountered solidarity and love. The garden had not only survived her attacks, it had thrived, becoming a beacon for the neighborhood, attracting attention from beyond the immediate streets, inspiring neighbors to plant flowers of their own, and reminding everyone that true beauty, nurtured with care and authenticity, cannot be diminished by pettiness or malice. Karen left the event, defeated, clutching her clipboard like a relic, while Grandma waved cheerfully, smiling as the community continued to laugh, share stories, and tend to the flowers, and it became evident that Karen had underestimated the transformative power of a colorful garden tended with love, the strength of quiet resilience, and the undeniable truth that kindness, joy, and beauty always find a way to triumph over negativity, cruelty, and narrow-mindedness, setting the stage for the final resolution in which the garden's victory would be cemented, Karen's influence permanently diminished, and the neighborhood forever bound by the story of the woman who refused to let her flowers be stolen, no matter how fierce the opposition. Section 5. Showdown, Karen's humiliation, and Grandpa's triumph. The moment of ultimate reckoning had arrived, the culmination of weeks of obsessive plotting, petty harassment, and relentless intimidation, and as Karen watched the sheriff calmly maneuver Grandpa's cherry-red Jeep back into its rightful place, her face twisted through shock, disbelief, and an almost tangible rage, realizing that every scheme, every complaint, every manipulative tactic she had deployed had utterly failed, and that the very neighborhood she had sought to control was now openly celebrating the man she had tried to humiliate, while Grandpa, seated in his Jeep, maintained a quiet, dignified composure, waving to cheering neighbors, children clapping and dancing in the street, and adults offering thumbs up and heartfelt congratulations, all while Karen's red-faced fury simmered in the background. Each futile attempt to assert authority met with laughter, applause, or polite indifference, and as the reality of public exposure sank in, Karen's veneer of control crumbled completely, her clipboard slipping from trembling hands, papers scattering like fallen leaves at her feet, a visual metaphor for her unraveling obsession, while whispers and giggles spread through the crowd, neighbors shaking their heads at her pettiness, some pointing out in muted tones that the entire spectacle had turned into a cautionary tale of how obsession and entitlement could lead to public humiliation, and yet Karen still, desperate to salvage even a shred of authority, opened her mouth to speak, only for the sheriff's calm voice to cut through the chaos, firm and unwavering. "Ma'am, the Jeep is legally parked, and Mr. Thompson has done nothing to warrant your harassment. I suggest you step back." The clarity and authority in his tone rendered Karen speechless, her attempts at justification evaporating in the presence of undeniable law, reason, and the collective judgment of the neighborhood, and with a final deliberate step, the sheriff exited the Jeep, offering Grandpa a nod of reassurance, while simultaneously delivering a quiet but unmistakable message to Karen that her obsession had reached its limits. that her control was no longer operative, and that her vendetta had not only failed, but had become a spectacle of folly witnessed by every resident who had endured her manipulations, whispered warnings, and relentless complaints, all of which now served to highlight her pettiness, her obsession, and the moral courage of the man she had tried to destroy. Karen's humiliation was absolute. She stood frozen in the street, her fury giving way to disbelief, unable to reconcile her perception of power with the undeniable reality before her, as neighbors began to openly mock her antics with gentle laughter, supportive claps for Grandpa, and whispered comments like, "That's what happens when you obsess over the wrong person, and some people really need to learn humility," while Grandpa, embodying calm dignity, stepped out of the Jeep, placing a reassuring hand on its hood, smiling at the crowd, and silently acknowledging the sheriff's intervention, a subtle yet powerful gesture that reinforced the triumph of justice, reason, and community solidarity over tyranny, obsession, and pettiness. And as the crowd erupted into applause, children waving handmade signs proclaiming Grandpa wins and justice for Maplewood, Karen's attempts to regain composure were met with polite but firm resistance, neighbors politely stepping around her, avoiding engagement, and making clear that she had no standing in this victory, that her obsession had alienated her from the very community she sought to control, and that the narrative had shifted entirely with Grandpa as the hero, the sheriff as the protector, and Karen as a cautionary footnote in the story of Maplewood Estates, remembered not for authority, but for arrogance, obsession, and spectacular public defeat. The celebrations continued, with neighbors coming forward to shake Grandpa's hand, offer congratulations, and recount stories of Karen's escalating vendetta, now reframed as an almost comical series of events highlighting her obsession and overreach, while Grandpa, always humble, acknowledged the support with soft smiles, quiet nods, and words of gratitude, reinforcing that this victory was not just his alone, but the triumph of a community united against unnecessary cruelty and harassment. A demonstration that even one determined, law-abiding, kind-hearted individual could withstand relentless attacks when bolstered by the support of neighbors, friends, and the principled intervention of authorities like the sheriff, and that the principles of patience, dignity, and moral courage were stronger than obsession, fear, or manipulation, leaving Karen to retreat, red-faced, defeated, and humiliated, while the community cheered, celebrated, and shared a renewed sense of unity, knowing that justice, reason, and integrity had prevailed, and that Grandpa's Jeep would remain a symbol of independence, resilience, and the triumph of good over petty tyranny for years to come, a lasting lesson etched into the collective memory of Maplewood Estates, a story of courage, loyalty, and moral victory that would be recounted whenever someone questioned the power of integrity, the value of community, or the consequences of obsessive, self-serving vendettas. And as the sun set over the Cull, DSAC casting warm light over the victorious Jeep and the jubilant neighbors, Grandpa leaned back, breathed deeply, and allowed himself a rare moment of quiet satisfaction, knowing that patience, dignity, and unwavering adherence to what was right had not only preserved his Jeep, his independence, and his reputation, but had also exposed Karen's obsession and cruelty in the most public, undeniable, and satisfying way possible. A triumph that would echo in the hearts and stories of the community for generations.